Hi, everybody. Welcome to an amazing film music media panel here. The focus of this one is going to be timing is everything. So we're going to look at how music works with the edit and the overall of attaining the desired outcome with timing and editing and precision. So let's jump in and introduce our amazing guests. So first up, we have the editor of the animated comedy Grimsburg. Please welcome Helene Hirten. Hey, Nina.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and next we have the composer on Netflix's Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. Please welcome Jonathan Scott Friedman. Hey, Jonathan. And next we have the composer of the drama feature Average Joe. Please welcome Andrew Morgan Smith. Hey, Andrew.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And last but not least, we have the composer for the Hulu series Paris Has Fallen. Please welcome Ian Arber. Hey, Ian.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to come together. I love when we get to just all, come together on a panel and just kind of share each other's experiences and insight, and it's always fascinating. So I guess to jump in, this is just we'll go down the line, but I'm curious, how do editors and composers collaborate to ensure that music enhances rather than detracts from the timing of a scene? I know it will differ on project, whether you come in late or start early, and if there's temp and all that. But I guess, Nina, if you want to kick us off, as an editor and how you work with music, and I know if you have another composer working with you, I'm curious, what's the collaboration like?
Well, it's different on every project for sure.
Yeah.
As a musician myself, I love to try and give the composer as much space as possible to do their thing. I personally hate working with temp tracks. It just kind of sets the composer up for a world of problems potentially later sometimes. But that said, it's sometimes you can't really get away from the temp stuff. So
Right.
as much as possible, I try to, I really want to try and hit whatever the director's vision is. And whenever I can, I try to be invited to or available for meetings with the director and the composer as well, just if even only to be a fly on the wall, so that I can make sure that, my temp, especially on a TV show like Grimsburg, for example, I want to make sure that I'm hitting something that's consistent, that's still working with the story, but that's also something that is going to project with the temp music what realistically is going to end up coming back. So obviously, It takes a little bit of time with the first few episodes to feel it out and figure out what that's going to be. But yeah, as much as possible, I just kind of like to be there and listen to the conversations that are happening between the showrunners, the directors, and the composers, so that if I do have to make temp music decisions, at least I'm making something that is informed in the right direction, and it's not too far off the mark. So
Yeah,
that's my approach anyway.
Oh, let me jump over to Andrew. Andrew, maybe talk to us about, working with an editor and with the cut changes and that kind of communication. Are you always in direct contact with the editor, or is the director or producer kind of a vessel, kind of like the bridge between the two? I'm curious what your experience has been.
I always prefer to be in contact with the editor, not only for creative reasons, but also just for logistical reasons. I never want to bother the producer or director with, hey, you mind if I get another pass of this with time code or whatever the issue is, So I think for logistical reasons alone, you should definitely be in touch with the editor. I know I always prefer to be. Additionally, the editor can give insight to sometimes to directors and producers' mindsets that they may not really be aware of. So I've had situations where the director is telling me something, the producer is telling me something else, and then I can kind of pick the editor's brain and find out oh, well, actually, this is how this conversation went in the edit bay, or over the course of months. Maybe there was an earlier conversation that no one's talking about that would be great to be privy to. And as for, talking more about, what Nina's talking about also is that I always like to try and try scenes as many different ways as possible, right? So in the spotting session, even possibly throwing in, if I have an idea, I'll sometimes cut up songs that I have in my music library of just source kind of style music and play different styles to picture, and pull as much music as I can out of the scene first and just see how it plays without anything, because sometimes we've seen it so many times with music that we've forgotten where we even are.
Yeah,
Um, and for those approaches, I find help me to kind of bring whatever is really necessary back, and we can leave the unnecessary beats out, you know.
absolutely. Yeah. So let's jump over to Jonathan. I'm curious what your experience is and how do you work with an editor to make sure the music works?
Yeah, well, so I was thinking about this, and I kind of think that a composer can be an editor's best friend on a project, and vice versa. Is
Yeah.
it, like you really think about it, like who else in the crew is thinking quite as much and spending as much energy and time on things like pacing and transitions and the ebb and flow of energy within and across scenes and how to create emphasis in certain moments. So the editor and the composer are really on the same mission, and they're just doing it from different using different tools and disciplines, but they really have to understand each other, I think. And the closer that they're in contact, I think the better, and the earlier in the process they can start collaborating, the better. As we've talked about, it's not always doable depending on
Yeah.
the constraints of the project, but when it is, something very, I think, very cool and organic starts to happen. So on Don't Tell Mom, for instance, great editor Arik Lewis and the director Wade Elaine Marcus. I had some initial sketches ready to play with by the time he did his first pass on the assembly, and and so, like, instead of using temp from other scores, we were just using my sketches, and they weren't always exactly right. Sometimes they were totally wrong, but they were like malleable, and I could they could give me feedback on what was working, what wasn't. They could say, we need some more of this vibe to try here or there, or maybe just send us 3 minutes of drums and then we'll kind of cut around it. And we started like that loose, a lot of trial and error, and gradually just kept going, more and more specificity as we got closer to the locked cut. So that by the time we got to a locked cut, I was kind of like the score was sort of like 70 to 80% set in there, like woven into what it done. We'd almost co-created the score together.
Wow.
And then I could focus the last stretch on filling in the missing pieces and mix and sound and refining and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's awesome. Ian, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think Jonathan just covered kind of the ideal scenario. As Nina was saying, in every single project, it's a different case. But for
Yeah,
me, it really is a very close collaboration, composer and editor. It's a discussion, giving space for experimentation for the composer, understanding, like from my perspective, understanding what the filmmakers want, and filmmakers, by filmmakers I mean director and editor, what they want from the scene, what's lacking, what's working, and maybe the temp is some influence there on what's working and what's not working, what they want the music to accentuate and to draw from the scene. So I think in those cases, as Jonathan was describing, when we're on board earlier, which in my case in television, Paris Has Fallen, we don't get on board that early in television, in TV series sometimes, but
yeah,
but if you do, it allows for the edit and the score to kind of evolve together and one to influence the other. So if we don't have a lot to cut, it could be that we're sharing music with the editor and they're using that as temp rather than random
right.
scores from other shows and other films, and that might actually tweak the edit, and the edit, of course, will potentially then come to the composer with your music temp in it, which is the dream, because then you can just enhance that further.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll stay with you, Ian, as we piggyback to the next the next question of how to kind of when you're trying to attain a certain emotion, whether it's something comedy, something drama, or a blend of genres, if you need to hit a certain emotional beat or a build or something that really pertains to the timing of a scene or the cut. If you're working with the editor and they already have the scene kind of cut with temp, whether it's your score or other music, how do you come in to make sure that that balance is maintained? Or if you're on early, I guess, enough where you are, working with the editor to, as Jonathan was saying, building it together, like what is the experience like, and how do you make sure that the timing, the music and the cut kind of marry and work together to get to that certain emotion or that blending of tones?
Yeah, to use your first part of the question, as an example, because I think the second part, yeah, is the ideal scenario being on board early, but I think
Sure.
that happens less so. So in the case of, temp music and especially in comedy, but also in, I guess, in any genre. But for me, it's important for the temp to be there in the spotting session with the editor and the director so that there is some sort of reference for us to discuss. Like, I love the temp here, which
Yeah.
we none of us ever want to hear. Or, the music's not really working here, or we want, the beat of where the music is building up to is great here, or, more quite often, I'm sure we all hear it, we couldn't really make this work with the music. So I think in any of those cases, for me, it's always a case of going into the studio, especially at the start of the process when you score the first scene, whatever scene you approach. I kind of, mute the temp track immediately and don't even refer to it and kind of approach the scene purely from my subjective musical approach or whatever
Yeah.
I feel is, especially when you're coming up with the palette and deciding where the beats are, because I kind of want to be influenced straight away by the edit, actually, the pace of the edit, especially if we're talking about timing, the acting, where the story beats are, which obviously the temp, sometimes they might have figured that in, they might have be thinking about the beats or something, or more often than not, they don't have the time and they're just using temp to kind of just have some music there. So I'd much prefer to be influenced by the edit and the acting and the filmmaking as opposed to a temp score, the Dark Knight track, whatever temp track they've used from a random epic score.
Right.
So I think that's a really good kind of initial approach. And then, the temp track is very handy for later on for you then to go and refer to and say, okay, well, actually, interestingly, I kind of hit a similar beats that they hit, or, oh, actually, I did it completely differently. And interestingly, they hit this beat here of that, green screen that I don't know what it is yet. So there must be something important going there. So I can go back in and do a second version or
Yeah.
adapt the initial piece. But, it just means that the initial kind of creative approach has not been contaminated by something previously.
Absolutely. Well, Jonathan, let's jump over to you because you were talking about how, with your experience of kind of building it together, what was, and as the cut is changing, you're seeing this kind of evolve and everything is kind of changing as it's coming together. So how do you maintain that right balance of timing? And if something shifts, changes, or they move a scene or something, how do you adapt as the composer?
Well, that can create some logistical challenges actually sometimes. Like when like for example, if they are if I've sent some stems, for example, and of a sketch, and they kind of molded it to a cut and have that pretty much set, and the timing's right and the general beats are right, and then it comes back to me to sort of uh, finalize and prepare for the final mix. And they've maybe made a little cut here and there, and some of the cuts are more musical than others. It can get a little challenging to you know essentially like um, recreate what they've done on the editing in the editing bay on on my side, and then get
Yeah,
that ready with the right musical assets to get to the final mix. But I think all told, I think it's still worth doing it that way despite some of the headaches. It's obviously like, there's less back and forth. It's a little bit more of a straight shot if uh, there's a final cut and it's ready, and maybe they got some temp and it's kind of on you, go, like, we're not going to change the cut anymore. There's then, I don't have to worry about them changing the music and then me having to readapt the music to how they've changed it and that sort of thing. But um, yeah, just to your initial question, I think despite the some of the logistical headaches of it, it's still worth it for the process that it engenders, and I think the outcome, which is really nice.
absolutely. Yeah. So Andrew, for your experience, what's it been like when you're, coming in and you have to find that timing, find it and things are changing and, trying to hit a certain emotional beat? Well, what's the process like for you with the editor?
I mean, once again, I think I find experimenting kind of similar to Jonathan's point a little bit, is like the experimental phase, and some of this works really well to say, um, you know, to be able to reference what they're working with the temp. I know that, like, so many people see temp as such a negative thing, but I've worked on so many projects, whether it be TV series or movies where, you know, we don't expect directors or producers or editors to be musicians. Sometimes it's great whenever they are, but like they can point to something and say, I really liked this, like what Ian was saying in the spotting session, to say, oh, I really liked the pacing of this. Or whenever you're really struggling on something, oh, it's just not hitting the right moments, they can go back to reference the temp of saying, well, I liked how it paced or how it did these things. And I think sometimes that can really help inform not necessarily compositionally what they want, as in like structurally, but like timing wise, really finding those beats. Um, and additionally, you know, having a relationship with an editor where you can either feed them temp or feed them stuff from the score you're already building, or give them ideas on something else. On Average Joe, it's this weird amalgamation of all these different genres of movies. There's comedic beats, there's family moments, there's, you know, thriller moments, there's all the different moments in it. And one of the ways we chose to service a lot of that was to go with source, you know, or not source, but to go with licensed tracks, you know.
Yeah.
And you can really play with especially whenever you're, you know, sometimes it's a montage or something, but other times, you know, you can put, not in this movie, but you can put something, say something very graphically violent, people will have something that's very light licensed over it, right? Like music that's very uplifting, and you have this juxtaposition between this dark and light thing going on. And I think really, in my mind, having a sandbox where you can play with these different ideas, and this space where people are willing to hear your ideas and willing to experiment with different movements and different things is, I think, really key for that collaboration we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nina, for you, I know you come with the, you know, musical knowledge and the editing knowledge, and I'm curious from your perspective, whether you're doing the music or somebody else is doing the music, what it's it like working, whether you're going to do the score later, or if you're going to have another composer come in, finding that timing, going through those changes and trying to find those emotions. Are you keeping an editor hat on and then thinking about music, or you always have music in your head while you're making the cuts, despite who's scoring it?
Despite my best efforts, there's always music going on in my head, so
Yeah.
there's no escaping that. But I do try to keep my editor hat on when I'm there to be the editor. That is
Yeah.
the primary focus of my purpose for being there. So I'll always work on that first. But I mean, I will say it's helpful if I'm, you know, to kind of trail back to what some of the others were talking about as far as rhythm goes, and pacing. It's especially when you have this is this is particularly true in comedy, I think, because in order for the comedy to work, you really have to have the dramatic moments, and
Yeah.
because it can't just be comedy all the way through. It just doesn't work. Drama, it could be drama all the way through and it'll work. I feel like. But with comedy, really, there's a lot. It's kind of like an accordion in some ways with pacing. So
Yeah.
so trying to balance it out and remember that, generally speaking, the comedy parts, especially in today's kind of aesthetic, I'd say, is really fast paced, and then making sure that you find the balance of those spots where it can breathe a little bit before you transition into something that needs to be dramatic.
Hmm.
That's where I really feel like music helps the most, to kind of bridge those gaps in between those two kind of conflicting
Yeah.
feelings that you're going to be feeling in this you know, in whatever piece you're working on. So I mean, I'm always thinking about how the music is going to be there or maybe not be there. In Grimsburg in particular, I mean, we have a lot of spots where there is no music because the joke is really supposed to be the king, and that's the only thing
Yeah.
that you're listening to is the written word. So we're very mindful about making sure that we're not stepping on jokes with music, because it's just not that kind of a show. So, but there is lots of action in it as well. So we need
Yeah.
lots of action music happening every once in a while, and then figuring out where the dropouts need to happen to make sure the joke hits. You know,
Yeah.
it's the music really, I feel like, is so important in all of that. So yeah, being able to
Absolutely.
kind of hear it as it comes along, in my head is helpful. I do a lot of temp on Grimsburg, mostly to help the network kind of feel it out, you know,
Yeah.
before Jesse, our composer, really has a time to do a proper pass. But eventually the library starts building up, and then you can start using source music from previous episodes, and then it becomes a little clearer as you go on, I find.
Sure. Once you build it out, and I mean, you kind of, or I was going to ask you kind of, you kind of touched on some of the things I was about to ask you. But so, as the editor for Grimsburg, how do you determine the rhythm and timing? Like, especially when you were talking about comedy and drama, and you talked about not having score for comedic hits, and but in terms, in an animated series, so how does animation differ from live action in terms of timing? Because with animation, it's pretty locked. Once you get that locked cut, it's hard to change as much as live action. It does change, of course, but I'm curious, like, what when it comes down to something and it needs to work, how do you find that pacing? How do you find that timing? And what makes comedic edit? I guess, to boil it down, what's the difference between comedic editing versus dramatic editing?
Ooh, well, that's a big question. Well, I'll go back to your first question, which is more about music. But yeah, as far as animation differing from live action, the beautiful thing about animation is that I get to make the timing.
Yeah.
It's all I can kind of decide how awkward does this joke need to be.
Yeah.
Can I make this pause like ridiculously long and still have it be funny, or do we need something in there? It all kind of comes down to what's the funniest thing that I can do, and that it almost always comes down to timing. So with live action, I sort of have to work with what I get.
Right.
If I only have one angle of coverage for a scene, then there's only so much longer I can make the pause, versus something with 20 different angles, then I can make that pause super long.
Sure. Yeah.
But that also changes the rhythm of the scene because you have cuts in it. So it's there's a lot of animation. I hesitate to say it's easier because it's really not, but as far as finding a rhythm, it's not as natural with animation because you really have to make it from scratch. I mean, you're coming in with pictures and still images at first, and then potentially some temp music or some library music or some source music or something like that to find the comedy in it, or the drama for that matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, and every show is different too. I mean, working on Grimsburg, they really want a super fast-paced comedy style, which is kind of more similar to Family Guy, let's say. And then on another show that I did called The Prince, for example, that was a much slower-paced show. I mean, that had Family Guy vibes too, but the jokes were much more paced out. It was very, kind of a walking pace versus a running pace, which is what I would consider Grimsburg. So,
Right.
so yeah, I mean, you have to look at the whole picture, and you have to look at the scenes, and then you have to find the balance. And I really feel like that's kind of what editing is all about, is finding the balance in the big picture and making it all make sense together. But yeah, the music is such a huge part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I want to go back to the kind of the group, about, we're talking about rhythm and building kind of comedic versus dramatic tension and finding these different emotional beats. But I'm curious if anybody has like an example where pacing kind of made or broke a scene where, when you're working on it, where maybe the cut didn't have the tension or the comedic punch that it needed, and the score was able to help out, or that it already was there and you didn't want to step on it too much and you had to find a balance of kind of pulling back. So maybe Ian, if you want to kick us off, is there an example from your work that where you're working with that cut to hit a comedic beat or a dramatic beat, and what your approach was?
Yeah, trying to think now. I've got a couple of examples, I suppose, which are, well, so Paris Has Fallen is about as non-comedic as you could possibly go.
Sure.
There's not one comedic element of it. It's like, crazy, massive action, 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 action. But I was just thinking about it. Actually, there are a few moments where there are kind of like you chuckle at a couple of the lines. And I think they're funny actually because there's no music there, And I
Yeah.
think Jonathan was talking about the juxtaposition earlier. it's because everything is so big and the music in Paris Has Fallen is like huge, big synths, big orchestra. And then when you have a little kind of comedic line after the serious music's dropped out, it just makes it funnier that it's completely clean, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The example I had in my head is this film I'm working on at the moment. It's Ken Jeong film called Tiger Mum, and I think it's actually a good example. Ken Jeong's a good example because he is he's quite a physical comedian. He's funny to look at,
yeah.
and also his comedy is quite like physical verbally as well. And that was actually a bit of a that was a whole conversation with the editor and the filmmaker, like how do we make this, like we don't want to, as a composer I don't want to detract from the comedy, you know, if it works about music, it works about music, we don't need music, but if we can enhance it in some way, that's, you know, that's what I'm there for. So in Ken Jeong's example with his comedy, I found that, you know, we found that making it more serious and actually making it more dramatic just made the comedy funnier. And in this film, he's quite a pathetic, in a funny way, character at the start, and he kind of ends up being a bit of a hero. So, and this was purely through a discussion with the editor and the director. We kind of, you know, we thought, why don't we kind of score him how he's would score himself, like
Yeah,
his perspective. So we kind of scored him as a hero when he was pathetic because we think he's quite a pathetic character, but he doesn't think he is. So they kind of just made it funnier. Like it's not funny music, it's serious music, but if there's anything we can do to put the comedy on a pedestal and kind of separate out so that, you know, the comedy really shines or it accentuates it or just enhances it in any way possible, it's just going to make it funnier. You know, anything for me, the worst thing you can do is put comedy music on a comedy scene and bring everything closer together because it's just going to detract
yeah.
from actually what you guys, all that work you guys have done, the editors creating this pace and creating these beats and these comedy moments that are already working. It, for me, it's about kind of just accentuating that and doing anything possible to kind of make that line and that comedy beat work better, even if that means not having music there.
Yeah, I mean that's I mean then you get into almost like a Looney Tune situation where it becomes kind of too zany or too I think I remember Hans talking about how like Jack Sparrow they wanted to make sure that it was the music in his head, like the Pirates theme is like his adventure theme that he's seeing, but he's, you know, this kind of ridiculous kind of character. And yeah, I mean and I grew up on the Zaz comedies, you know, all the Zucker Abrams Zucker spoofs like Naked Gun and Airplane, and it's scored so seriously, you know, all those scores who, you know, it's just, and then the comedy plays in juxtaposition with that. But yeah, Jonathan, if you want to piggyback on that, because you know I'm curious in your perspective.
Well, I totally agree with what Ian said about sometimes the best thing you could do is have silence, especially after a period of music and maybe building. Like, I think I came across the the I think I came across this idea in the book On the Track by Fred Karlin. It's like a seminal like book on film scoring. But he somewhere in there he said basically like if you have music going and building and then it stops, just by default, the next moment is emphasized and highlighted. So like
Yeah,
for if you have a comedic moment in a kind of sequence of intense moments and there's music under the intense moments and it drops out, automatically you're like it's almost like the absence of the music is the thing that makes you lean in. And so you know, I think that works really well with comedic beats. And yeah, I mean, I personally love I love like suddenness. And when the edit and music can come together to create like sudden shifts. So like it's just a great way to propel the story forward. So like
you're talking about like turning
an
like
example.
on a dime, just like changing like, the tone or
Yeah,
the tonal
or I mean,
shift.
or just even using the cut and not trying to smooth it out. Like so, like
Yeah,
if you have a nighttime scene and like in I mean, I'm just most recently like in Don't Tell Mom, there's a scene at night and the siblings are arguing. It's an intense emotional conversation. There's some hard truths that they share with each other, and then like the last point is made and it kind of lingers there for a second. It's just silence, and you hear maybe there's some crickets, and then there's a hard cut to the next day in the office, and she's kind of falling asleep at her desk. And
yeah,
right on the hard cut, there's downbeat, and it's like up, it's like sunny, jazzy or score, and it's just like immediately you're like, oh, what's happening now? It kind of like the drama of the previous scene just sort of like pops like a bubble, and you're like into the next scene. And I
Yeah.
like which would be a totally different, if there was like a dissolve shot into the next day, for example, that would be a very different musical approach, I think. I mean, I think it wouldn't work as well with just like a boom into the
Yeah.
next thing. And so I like, and also I think Nina said it too, like just this accordion of going from when you drama, comedy, space, silence, moments of punctuation, moments of sharpness, angularity. I think that all that stuff makes things interesting and you can use those sharp turns to your advantage, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love what Nina, how you explained it, Nina. That's perfect. The accordion is such a perfect metaphor for it. But Andrew, for you, I'm curious about your perspective on getting that, that timing.
Yeah, I think that I mean, everyone's done so much coverage of the ideas. The same thing, like Henry Mancini scored all these, Pink Panther, all these great shows, and like
Yeah.
he always, played it all straight, right? Let the dialogue, let the writing speak for itself, and don't walk all over it. So generally, I have that approach and dropping out, like letting that stuff build, and then all of a sudden pulling all the music out for the line that's important, and then coming back in. Especially so many projects, at least, there's the idea that the audience kind of takes in like a line or a beat or whatever the moment is, right? So I don't know. Some person comes in and says a joke. Well, it takes the audience a second to process the joke anyway,
Sure.
right? And then you can come back in with the music that would reflect whatever the next thing is going to happen. So if they're going to move, if they're physically if doing something, if they're running or whatever, now the music can kind of take you into the next moment. Um, when it comes to my own experiences, I did a movie which is like one of those things. It's like this is you always have sort of fondness for certain movies, and one of mine is called "You Might Be the Killer," and it's this like kind of meta horror movie where the whole premise of the movie was based on a Twitter conversation, but the whole thing is like this camp counselor calls his friend who's runs a comic book store, and he's telling her someone's killing kids at the camp, and he's trying to figure out who it is. Well, the challenge of the pacing on this movie, it's a horror comedy movie, and the challenge was we started the movie in the third act. So it's actually like the movie is non-linear, and we really had to kick it so that the audience in the first few minutes knows it's a horror movie and it's a comedy and it's okay to laugh,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like so we had these very specific things we had to do and accomplish within the first, I think it was within the first minute of the movie. Um, and so the editor, Stephen File, came up with this great idea, which was to have like basically stills of these different locations where there are kills, and have the lead actor, who was Fran Krantz, to like scream like "Oh my God!" and then like it would cut to the next thing, and it would cut to the next thing. But after each one, like there's like a title shot, and at each after he would scream, there's a huge like horror hit, right? Like
Yeah.
orchestral, gigantic smash, and then we like smash cut into him running away from somebody. Then we get all the way to a point where he opens his phone and it won't open because he has Face ID, so he has to like wipe his face off from blood and smile, and then it opens.
Yeah.
And so like there was this whole set of challenges in this sequence, which was it has to be very kinetic because he's immediately running, right? We have to build the momentum. We have to set up the audience to know this is going to be funny. It's not just a horror movie. And so, the big orchestral hits really helped to, and obviously the editor's brilliant idea of making this intercut sequence, and Fran's yelling in between each thing. And then at the very end, the after we have this running sequence with this very, frantic and kinetic musically as well, is we get into the cabin, and taking something, and I experimented over and over again because we knew we needed something that had to be we had to give funny, but we didn't want it to say ha 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 funny, right? In
Right.
like
Right.
time to laugh now, which was what ended up landing on doing was taking something that still would people would feel cliched, which is pizzicato strings, right? but playing it in a non-comedic way, right? So playing it, I think it was like moving tritones or something. So it still has the lightness of the the cliche, but it's used in a kind of unorthodox way. So we still get this kind of off kilter, funny moment with him opening his phone with his bloodied, smiling face, you know. And I think finding ways to build on these cliche ideas, I think can also help in create like build on them as in take them and then turn them into their own thing, right? So,
Sure. Yeah.
uh, you know, Pirates being a great example of something where it's like feels swashbuckling, but it also feels new at the same time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that's a I want to segue over to Jonathan because I know I'm curious, Jonathan, your work balances nostalgia and modern storytelling as seen in the in Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead and that reimagining. So I'm curious, how did you use kind of music to time comedic moments while keeping it modern and still making it feel maybe a little bit nostalgic, but also new for anybody who maybe this is their first experience. They don't have that nostalgic, backstory in their head or that feeling, anything connected to the original.
Yeah, so actually, we thought a lot about how, and I think Andrew mentioned this earlier. We thought a lot about how score could interact with songs and source music and non-diegetic songs, and like so we had a lot of songs in there from artists like Tierra Whack and Jordan Ward and Glorilla, very like unmistakably current
Yeah,
sounding
yeah,
things, and that we leaned on that to like anchor us in the here and now. And that established just the sense of time and place that this is a modern story. This is happening today. And obviously the script was that too, but the sounds of today were very much in there. So we thought about score within the context of that and again in juxtaposition to that. So the with the songs being very much of today, that freed us up to be a bit more experimental with the score and the and I guess you could play say we played up the nostalgia angle sort of in the just trying to make it sound like more classic and whimsical, the kind of sounds that you'd get in some of those late 80s, early 90s films.
yeah.
And and yeah, the instrumentation's mostly orchestral and jazz, and so like that became like the two palettes that were that played off of each other. And oftentimes we would use the orchestral and the whimsical kind of sound when it was the kids alone at the house, and then we'd have kind of different sounds of today when they were out in the world interacting with adults and stuff like that. So um, yeah, it's a balance, and definitely the songs are another best friend of composers, I think, and just like realizing that you don't have to do it all by
Yeah.
yourself, and it's often like the how the songs interact with or how the score interacts with the other songs with the other music and songs in the movie is really where the magic happens.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also, I think, a challenge to find how you can get in, lead up to a song and get out of a song. And I'm curious for Jonathan, if there's ever been a needle drop that where you went, oh man, I wish I could have scored this scene instead. It's like a really powerful scene or something, and they're using a needle drop, and you went, damn it, have you ever encountered
Yeah,
that?
I mean, yes, sometimes it's like when they use a good song for a montage, you're like, oh man, I wish
Yeah,
I could have done the score for that.
yeah,
But sometimes songs, and especially we underestimate sometimes the power of vocals and also how much like
yeah,
a lot
yeah,
of people hear vocals before they hear everything else. Like the composer world, like I hear the sound, I hear the music before I hear the vocals. But we sometimes forget how much people are cued by vocals and
It's like
lyrics.
it's funny because everything that we're talking about is so psychological too, right? We're analyzing how humans react, and of course, we are tuned to hear another human's voice and it pierces through, like a baby's cry is meant to pierce through to
Yeah.
the parents, and it's just like we're tuned to that. But it's just when you think about all these
Yeah.
pacings that everything we've been discussing, it's just like how do you get this emotion, and you're just trying to break down the human psyche to just build it. I think it's so fascinating.
Well, what's cool, something I don't know if other people have done this, but I love that when you can do source to score or score to source. That's always super fun. Like
Yeah.
when you have something that's supposed to be kind of playing outside, and then it all of a sudden, or like playing in the world, and then all of a sudden it kind of becomes a commentary. Or actually, in Don't Tell Mom, we did one where we blended it's a party scene, and they're playing Juveniles Back That Ass Up, and then like it like kind of slows down and then merges into a piece of score that has a similar like Pitts sound as Back That Ass Up, and then but it's like it's a kind of funereal, more like much more serious thing, and then there's the juxtaposition of these kids like twerking and partying, and then also it's at the time when the babysitter died, so it's kind of fun that like
Yeah.
just smooth
Those are, I mean, when
transition.
you mentioned that, the one that pops in my head that it's a little bit different because it's not diegetic music, but Twister, the original from the '90s, Twister, the John DeMont. One of my
Yeah.
favorite moments is when it's leading up to Van Halen's "Humans Being" song, and Manchina is literally quoting the song in the score, and you have no idea it's happening until it just cuts, and then it boom, the song plays, and I'm just like, wow, that was like one of my favorite buildups, and I love that example so much. Like it's just like this moment where you're like, oh my God, he was the whole song was in the score building up to it, and it was built in with his themes. I thought it was such a and like, I'm sure it was so much fun to crack that or build up to that. So yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But I was going to ask about this, but I think we covered a lot of it. So maybe I'll focus this next one just to you, Nina, because as the editor, what considerations go into when you're talking about transitioning between comedic and dramatic moments within the same project? When does it not work, I guess? How do you make it like, if you one of my favorite shows is Scrubs, by the way. So I love how Scrubs can be so goofy in one moment and then make you cry in the next moment. Is there a secret sauce to the cut to make sure that works where it doesn't wallop the audience and feel awkward? I'm curious in your experience in editing and finding those juxtaposing kind of emotions.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is one of the harder things when you start really mixing genres, like
Yeah.
truly mixing genres. I did mention earlier the accordion, of course,
Yeah.
and I really do think that comedy works best when you have those dramatic moments, and so that's probably why Scrubs was so great and so popular, is because it really did beautifully transition between both of those feelings,
Yeah. Yeah.
so seamlessly. So trying to do that um, is all about the pacing, as far as I'm concerned. You have to work for live action. You have to work, of course, with the pacing of the dialogue that's happening between the actors on the screen, but there's still a lot of space to figure out where you can massage those transitions, as long as you're still keeping the bigger picture in mind. Because
And are you
yeah,
reacting
if you go
like
too
when
fast,
is it just your emotional react when you put the cut together? Do you have to sit back and watch and try to like get your mind out of the fact that you were the one building it, and or do you bring somebody else to be like, hey, is this working? Like I'm curious, like when you're in it, you always kind of need maybe like a second pair of eyes or ears, and we've seen with composers, like, hey, is this actually working? I don't know yet. I've been too immersed in it.
oh, totally. Yeah, no, that
Yeah,
that is definitely a thing. I feel like the more seasoned editors have gotten good at removing themselves,
yeah,
from the process, where they can sit and instead place themselves in the position of the intended viewers, whatever that demographic might be. But it's, honestly, that's why I love in-person edits. That for me, that's really where that conversation happens, and it's
yeah.
very frustrating in this digital world where that has kind of become a thing of the past. You really don't get the same ideas about about how people are feeling about a scene when you're not in the same room with them. So,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, one of my favorite things, honestly, some people hate this, but I think that the test screenings are just like the best things. um, I remember at Bento Box, which was the animation studio that I was working at before lockdown and all that. Every week they would show some work in progress of one of the shows that the studio was working on, and everybody in
yeah,
the entire studio would come and sit in this big screening room, and we'd all watch this animatic, and it might not be a final animatic, it might be a work in progress, but you can kind of get an idea of like what all your coworkers are doing,
yeah,
but also you get to, for me anyway, whenever we got to show one of the shows that I was working on, I'd be sitting there and being like, are they laughing? What are they thinking? Okay, how are they feeling right now? Ooh, somebody just coughed. They're clearly bored. It's like, what can I garner from this gigantic group of people? Because this is who I'm trying to impress, really. When it comes down to it, it's not me. It's not my show. So I
yeah.
wanna know how things are playing. And if I'm missing the mark, then I really want to know that, because obviously I want to do a better. I want to serve the show. Um, so I mean, to me, it's all about the collaboration, and the more that I
Yeah.
can kind of like get people in the room with me to listen to it and watch it and see it, and I can feed off of that response. But these days it's a little trickier. I'm focusing a little bit more on notes than the energy of things. I'm hoping that isn't permanent, but that kind of went away from your original question. But
No, no
yeah,
worries.
that's
Yeah,
I really feel like that's how you get
yeah. No, yeah. I mean,
that's how you get
it's
out of that headspace.
reacting. It's weird when there's another person in the room, and immediately you start placing yourself in that in their headspace. It's like you're able to just like embody them. You're like, oh, I can get out of it. And I remember in college I was working at a movie theater and I was a projectionist, and it was funny. I would always, you'd see the same movie over and over throughout the day as you're starting movies and you're in the booth, if it was a movie coming out that I already had already seen, I'd always like pop my head in to see if audiences are laughing at the right place, like at the same time. And it's just like it's amazing how a perfect edit can have everyone laughing at the same time or be completely still at the same time. I remember when Paranormal Activity would come out, I'd watch to see when the jump scares would hit and see how it would react. I mean, I was just using it as like a way to study it. It was fantastic. But but I want to jump
Oh,
over
movie theater is a
to
great lesson.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean
movie
that. Yeah,
theaters
and
like
that when I hear it when
great.
stars like, oh, put in like, sunglasses, go sneak in. I mean, I get it. I get that when they want to see it like with an actual audience that's not there as a focus group. But yeah, for sure. But Andrew, I want to jump over to you because an average Joe use synths and other forms of instrumentation that are often atypical for the genre. So, how did you work to incorporate these sounds in a way that musically serve the unique drama and emotion of this film?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, Average Joe is kind of the mix of everything. It has all these different elements of it's a football movie, it's a family movie, it's a love story, and at the core of the movie, the most important thing is that it is a love story. It's the story of these two characters and going through their life as troubled kids all the way through adulthood. Um, and so early conversations with the director and the editor and the whole team was, hey, this isn't necessarily in the genre space that we usually are in. So
Yeah.
we don't want it because it was temped with things like Friday Night Lights and very cornerstones of of genres, right? So oh, Friday Night Lights is such a seminal show and project in those spaces. So they said we first thing is we really don't want this to feel like everything else. Like we don't want
Mhm.
people to be like, oh, this is exactly what it is. And then the other thing was there are some like Christian elements to it too, but they didn't want that to overshadow any of the other parts of it. So they said the other thing is we don't want it to be preachy. So like whatever we can do to minimize those are like the two big asks on this film at the moment. Um and so for me, it goes back to kind of what I talked about on You Might Be the Killer of like, okay, well, what are these elements that yeah, maybe cliched in the pop culture, but how can we take something and do something interesting? And even play something a little bit different to picture. So something like, Peaky Blinders is scored in a rock genre, but it's set in the early 1900s, right? It's an amazing score on a great show, but like they committed to it,
Yeah.
you know? And and it just works, right? Because it embodies this idea. So I set about and a little selfishly of mine, I've been getting into modular synthesis. So I was like, well, maybe I can make this work. So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
started to experiment with that, and they really liked it. So it has like the hallmarks of the genre of it has the guitar with the crazy reverb on it. It has, orchestra on it. It has these things, but it also has elements that feel new and more edgy, at least for that genre of film. And like I said, I mean the core element of the movie is this love story, right? So emotionally, as long as we're servicing that, and I think we commit to it, right? I think so many people not committing to the idea or just like kind of halfway pursuing the idea creates like kind of we just fall back into the cliches if we don't
Yeah.
really push that boundary. And I think that's what really ended up working for that movie was playing with those cliches and making them trying to find an interesting way to approach them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was going to jump into talking about temp music and stuff, but I think we covered so much of that. So I want to cover, I'll jump over to Ian because, I want to talk to you about how you kind of differentiate your approach for, I guess, dramatic and suspenseful moments and like a high stakes narrative, versus quieter emotional scenes. You were talking about, when to pull back. How do you know when to do less, and how do you know when it needs more, when maybe the cut is not hitting so hard and you need the score to just come in and go oomph and just kind of push it over the edge?
That is a good question. How to know that? Um, yeah. Again, it's so much of it is a subjective point of view, right? We
Sure.
all, me, Andrew, and Jonathan, and Nina, if you're going to you're a musician as well. So say you squad a movie, we'd all do it so differently. And we'd all have a different opinion on how big it goes, right? The fundamental at the start of the process, it is a discussion, really. Sitting there with the editor and the filmmaker and saying, you know, how dramatic do you want this dramatic moment to be? Because I could make it very dramatic, or we could actually let the drama unfold because it's kind of doing it visually. And usually, as a composer, we'll have an opinion, but we want to get. I don't want. It's a discussion. I want to hear what the
Yeah.
filmmaker has to say, and then say, okay, I agree with that, or actually, I think this. And I think to come back to directly to your question, there's kind of three different approaches that how I would handle emotion was one of them, right? Emotional
Yeah, yeah.
scenes,
Kind of
dramatic.
motion
So let's say
suspense.
like
Yeah.
emotion, yeah, emotion, suspense slash thriller scene, and like a dramatic moment. I think are three actually quite different approaches because a dramatic moment, as we've already discussed, I think, you kind of get a feeling for how big you need to push it. And sometimes it's worth
Mm.
like, okay, we need to build up to this dramatic moment. Let's build and crescendo up and then allow the dramatic moment to hit or, land on it to make it more dramatic, literally. And that can be a little bit of an experimental back and forth between composer, editor, director to kind of see, okay, we tried the big, we don't need to go that big, or this is quite small. Actually, I think we can push this a bit further. So that's a little bit of an experimentation. Um, Kind of suspense thriller for me feels like even though I'm always looking for a story beat to come in and go out with the music, a music cue. Um, that for me, generally speaking, from my experience, tends to be more of a kind of a slow, quiet lead in, almost like sneaking in without the audience knowing,
Yeah.
and kind of building the suspense and tension that way. So kind of like a bit more, well, much more subtly, more like kind of building tension without the viewer really noticing that the music's doing that. And then before they know it, oh, I'm feeling the music and it's really getting the heart rate up. And then kind of looking for a story beat to come out, or if there isn't an obvious kind of endpoint for that suspense and tension, kind of like, rising and then falling into a transition or whatever into the next scene. And then emotion, again, like in fact, that's probably the one where I'm relying less on the cut. I think dramatic action, all that kind of stuff, thriller,
Yeah.
tension. There is a pace set by the edit that I'm relying on to decide whether I'm doing the opposite or doing the same and flowing with it or flowing against it.
Yeah.
Whereas in emotion, in an emotional scene, obviously asking the question, why is the music here? What's the purpose of the music in this moment? What are we trying to say? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to enhance rather than just being an emotional atmosphere? I'm looking for a story beat. So the in would be, maybe there is a little trickle of a tone, but when the actual meat of the cue starts, it needs to be on a story beat. Whose perspective is it from? What are we trying to say? And then looking for a reason to go out because it's not just about putting music over the whole of the emotional scene. You want to just be enhancing the actual story beat and helping the filmmaker tell the story with music and just kind of supporting the narrative in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's I think yeah, it's such a it's so subjective, but it's also again, we're going back to the human psyche thing where it's like we're all humans and we kind of react to the same thing. I kind of grew up in the camp where I love when like a score will take over. I know people will kind of like criticize that or, critique it as too manipulative, but I mean, I grew up where, there's moments like at the end of ET where it's just like 20 minutes of score and nothing else. And it's just like I'm sobbing. And then anytime John Williams did it at the bowl and they did that final act, I'd just be like, okay, I'm done. Like, but today you wouldn't see that. You would be like, oh, that's too manipulative. It's too much. It's too saturated with score. But I'm just like, I don't know. I miss those big moments where it's like and there is quiet moments too and finding that balance but I'm always for a sucker for just push it up just get the gear going but to
And interestingly,
yeah go
on
ahead.
that, Kaya, like I think the medium that allows for that more in this day and age for me is comedy. That's
Yeah,
actually one of the genres where it does allow for people to, for us as composers to be a bit more bold. Yes, animation as well. You could have a conversation with John Powell for hours about why he does animated movies, right? It's
sure.
same with comedy for me. It's like that is a chance for us to do that, and you're working with a good editor and a director who appreciate what the music's going to do to it. That is the only time in my experience that we've had that space to actually have those kind of ET moments because we're
Yeah,
not, there aren't movies like that anymore.
yeah,
As a quick
absolutely.
side note, though, as a quick thing, I think I always get so frustrated by it because I've obviously gotten. I'm sure we all have. I'm sure Ian, Jonathan, I'm sure Nina as well has gotten like, well, it's too manipulative, and I'm like, guys, we're making a movie.
It is supposed to be.
Like it's literally putting music anywhere in the scene is manipulative, right?
I
Like that
agree
at
100%.
the base point of it, right? Like if I and I'm maybe I'm just like so OCD about this. It's like I even think to myself of like if there's two characters and we want someone to sympathize with one or the other, and we have someone says something and then we have a reaction shot we cut to. If we start music on whoever we start music on, that's who we're going to sympathize with generally,
Mhm.
unless it's I don't know, horrific or something. But generally like in my mind, this is how I associate it. And it's like there is no non-manipulative music, right? Like
Great,
Very
yeah.
true.
and so just,
Even
it
editing,
always
the
it's
the
like
cut is manipulative. You're trying to find short, you can do shot cuts. I remember, studying the end of Bonnie and Clyde, in the film school and just looking at shot cuts and how quick cuts can do it. How longer, I'm a fan of Leone, he's my favorite filmmaker, and then watching Once Upon a Time in the West, where a shot will linger and then how it manipulates you. And I go into theater and I just say, "Here's my hand. Hold me, take me on the ride." And I feel like people when they say it's too manipulative, I'm like, "Why are you fighting it? Why are you fight? If you then you probably don't like movies. Then why are you even watching if you don't want to be, when it's a tearjerker? Good. I want to cry. I want to laugh. I want to be scared. So that's why I like the Conjuring movies. Oh, it's just jump scares. Yeah, but it's meant to do it. It's like a little theme park ride. It's like fun. It's not supposed to be like something rich in substance. You're there to get scared. So it's like, but yeah,
Those are
but
actors, they're not real people, so they are
I know,
technically
right? They're
manipulating you.
manipulating. Yeah, everyone's it's all manipulation. And that's why I love it. It's storytelling. It's like I always equate it to like a movie theater is like this big glowing screen. It's just like sitting around a campfire. You have someone who's gonna really embellish it up and put on a voice, when your parents are reading you storybooks and getting into character. It's like it's all just trying to get you to a certain feeling. And that's what I love about everything that you guys do and everything that what storytelling is, visual and musical storytelling. But to kind of close up our discussion, I'm curious, we can go around and, what advice would you give to emerging editors or composers about kind of mastering timing and finding that, like, when you were kind of getting your chops, were you just looking at other films, just watching a lot of that? Were you practicing maybe scoring scenes from movies that already exist? I love seeing like, I remember the big thing was like that Shining trailer that made it look like a romantic comedy where you can just play with something that's completely different, recut it and practice, that person was figuring out how to make it funny. So I'm curious for you, what are maybe one or two tips that you would recommend to somebody for practice and kind of mastering it? So I don't know, Nina, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, let's see. I'm gonna go back to the have your friends watch it and sit with them.
Yeah.
If you can't do like a screening, or if you're allowed to
Just
show
yeah,
it, then
yeah, use a focus
the,
group of your friends
but
to
if
see if you're
you're
getting it.
if you're cutting like your friends' movies and stuff, and you're learning, you're starting to build your reel and stuff like that. I mean, you're really not gonna understand how different people feel things until you experience them feeling it. I mean, you're really not going to. It's
Yeah.
everybody comes with their own subjective opinions and backstories and stuff like that, and there's no one size fits all way to do something. So, but the more people that you can kind of be around and watch them how they react to different situations, and kind of put on a little bit of a psychologist hat in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sense, then it's really going to inform how you pace things. And I will say that if you're not musically inclined, then cut as many music videos as you possibly can, because that's really going to teach you
Yeah.
kind of forced pacing in some ways, depending on what kind of song it is. But you'll start to notice patterns like, oh, am I always cutting on the downbeat? Always? That's really boring to watch most of the time. So, you gotta you're gonna start realizing where you can break up the rhythm in a place that makes sense versus am I just always going to hit it on the snare, And
Yeah.
so the more different kinds of music that you cut to, the better. And that does actually translate into narrative and unscripted work too, really. I mean, you have to music is such an important part of it that you have to kind of be musical as an editor. And if you're not
Yeah.
inherently musical or inclined that way, then you're going to have to kind of put yourself into situations where you can be musical so that you can learn how rhythm actually does affect everything, the story and the feelings. And yeah, so that's what I would do. That's how
Yeah,
I would suggest.
absolutely. Jonathan, how about you? Any tips to hone in that skill?
Well, sort of all of the above, the things that you mentioned, sort of. I mean, I would say definitely study the moments of from your favorite movies and TV shows that you
Yeah.
like. Like if something that repeatedly is like, I love that. Like, don't just move on from that and be like, oh, I love it. Like really like break it down. What's happening there? What and kind of incorporate it into your language, into your references, frame of references. Um, like I think that's one. So you just have in your mind, you start to get little touchstones, examples you can kind of access at different times of like, oh, that was an example of a great dropout and kind of silent moment. This was a great example of kind of a pre-lap moment that brings you into the next scene. You just sort of get a kind of a feel for mechanically what is happening in the moments that you like.
Yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, I mean, it's it's not a bad idea to practice to find things out there, take the sound out, try your own thing. I mean, that's but it's hard to that's better than nothing, but it's definitely not a replacement for working on a project and and working with other people, making mistakes, getting their reactions to things like um because that's how you really hone the skill. And what I've found personally is that there's a big difference between um making music that is like suitable for film and TV and versus actually scoring to picture. Like they're
Right.
like they're different things. Like when you're scoring to picture, you're really doing something. You're like you're tailoring uh music to the specific contours of the edit. And that's different. That musically, that flows differently than if you're just making a piece that could sort of
Yeah.
be placed as,
It's like not an off the
um,
rack suit. It's like a fully tailored, suit
yeah,
to,
it's a
yeah, yeah.
fine tailored suit. And so like it's a different skill set. And I think you can't, there's just no substitute for like tr being on projects, however small or big. You learn something every time, and especially from the feedback that you get. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Well, how about you, Andrew?
I mean, I'd say piggybacking off of, what Nina and Jonathan are saying. I think that, um, that saying of 10,000 hours to master a skill, right? And I think that the more you study something, and that doesn't necessarily mean writing the music itself, but like the more you study it, the more you get feedback, the more you hone what you're doing, the better off you are. And
Yeah.
and in an industry that is so super saturated, I think finding ways like the more you do this, the more times you have an opportunity to write your own music, to work with people, um, the more you're honing your own character of your own sound, right? So,
Yeah.
um, like you're having your own sound in this industry can be a really great distinguishing way of getting work and keeping work and all that kind of stuff. So, I think finding ways to study, collaborate, and hone your own abilities and your own sounds, I think is so key whenever you're doing this, and when it comes to, grabbing anything you can to work on. I mean, I worked on, before I started professionally working, I worked on random stuff. I begged a friend of mine to edit together a horror comedy trailer that he and his brother had shot in the backwoods one day in high school, right? And they
Yeah.
didn't do anything with it. I begged him to edit to edit it together so I could score it. And like that, just getting the hours in, and knowing how you like to work and how you like to interpret those ideas, like what Jonathan was talking about, of incorporating these character ideas, the tension and release into your own, um, working style and workflow is really key for sure.
Absolutely. Well, Ian, how about yourself?
Guys have covered everything. Like, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, for me, it's always exactly as Andrew said, mastering anything comes down to hours, like 10,000 hours, whatever. I think the only thing I can add really is, and again, actually, Andrew, you kind of covered it. Like, I think especially at this day and age in the industry, more than ever, it is 100% about voice and what you're doing that's unique to everyone else. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
through that experience and those 10,000 hours, and sure, you can study whatever composers are doing as much as you want in terms of timing, but at the end of the day, timing is very much a subjective point of view as well. So that is your voice as a composer as much as the instruments you use, the melodies you use, the music you write. So I think, your voice is your musical opinion, your subjective point of view, how music should be used in that moment. So the more experience you can get writing to picture, short films, as the guy said, rescoring scenes, whatever, the more you're experimenting and trying things out, the bigger your toolkit for scoring approaches, or the bigger a toolkit for scoring approaches you have. And I think it's just so important to have that time to experiment and kind of figure out what your voice is, rather than going like, oh, John Williams does this in a comedy moment, Hans Zimmer does this in a
Sure.
comedy moment. It's like, what would you do? And the only way of discovering that is by just putting in the hours and getting the experience and collaborating with people and working out, what your taste is. That's the word at the end of the day. It's like everyone, all of us have our unique taste in how we think things should be done. And it's like, you know, holding on tightly to that and massaging that and growing that is the thing that's going to lead to, I think, opportunities.
Yeah. And I mean, I would throw in just, you know, also it's important to, yeah, to understand the fundamentals and the foundation of why something works, why is something scary, why is something comedic, but also look back at those moments in film history where, um, somebody really thought outside the box and it became, just did something for the first time. And I was like, this probably sounded crazy at the time doing it, but then all of a sudden everyone else is doing it. And you just look at just even like trailer trends. Like right now, every trailer is some like broken down version of a pop song, and we went from like
Everyone, every single
every
one.
single
When's
one.
that trend? When's that trend gonna end?
I know
I
I'm
wonder.
ready for the Brahms, the Inception Brahms to come
Let
back. I'm
let's go
excited.
back to let's go
In a
back. I
world,
mean,
I miss the
yeah.
Don LaFontaine days. But you look at how it changes through society, or if you go back and study, French New Wave filming, and when Jean-Luc, Godard was doing, jump cuts for the first time, it's like that we take that for granted now. But somebody, or when in the 70s when the zoom lens was invented, and you look at Dirty Harry and all these movies, and everybody is trying zooming in and shots, and you're what is the and everyone's just trying it and figuring it out. So I think as it's so saturated right now and everybody has a 4K camera in their pocket, who can make a movie, I think it's important to just keep experimenting and figuring out what works. And if it doesn't work, then you go back to the drawing board. So, but I think right now it's not so much of learning, but mastering, but like finding out what is new. Again, everyone talked about how all the filmmakers want their project to be unique in some way, and it's tougher to do it now. I think it's the toughest time to ever be a storyteller because it's everyone's telling stories, and whether it's social media or anything. So, but yeah, but everybody, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sitting down and talking. So thank you, Nina, Jonathan, Ian, Andrew. Thank you so much for all your insight. It's so inspiring and fun to sit down with you guys. And thank you to Impact 24 for helping co-produce this amazing panel. And tune in for the next one. Thank you.